On this Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, we are looking at some dynamic duos. No, not Damichael Cole and myself, although we are pretty dynamic. There's three pairings across the NBA that have recently been formed of former Grizzlies in the Western Conference in particular. How are they going to stand in the way of Memphis? And what are some storylines to look at as the season approaches? We'll talk about that on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
It's a Tuesday edition of Locked On Grizzlies. We are so thankful to have you with us wherever you're checking out the show on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube, wherever you are, however you are partaking in the Locked On Grizzlies fun. Damichael Cole and I are here together, and we are thankful to have you with us. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. As always, we are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every single day. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe over on YouTube, as I mentioned a moment ago, Apple, Spotify, Amazon. Literally anywhere you get a podcast, you can get Locked On Grizzlies. Hopefully you're an everydayer at this point, checking out the show each and every time an episode drops. We had a great show yesterday. We're going to have another strong one today, and we'll carry you through the week as July ends and August begins here on Locked On Grizzlies. So if you're only subscribed on YouTube, you definitely should check out Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you take in your podcasts. If you're only subscribed on the audio side, you should definitely add YouTube. And that way, wherever you are, wherever you're taking in the program, you can enjoy Locked On Grizzlies, both video and audio wise. Damichael Cole is my co-host of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Damichael, I hope you're well. And I'm excited about this themed episode of the podcast because you and I, we know a thing or two about dynamic duos. That's how we reference ourselves, or at least how I reference us. I think that this is going to be a fun conversation because, as I mentioned earlier, there are three somewhat freshly new and minted pairings of former Grizzlies on teams that plan to be contenders in the Western Conference, or at least trying to be.
Yeah, I mean, they're all over the West, and the importance of you saying these teams are trying to be contenders is these are teams that could be in the Grizzlies' way. Like, it's funny because, we'll go through all the names, throughout the episode here. But when you think about, Dylan Brooks, when you think about Steven Adams, you think about them being starters on a 56-win team, right? You think of Tyus Jones. You think of, the Grizzlies being, I think, 17-2 or 17-3 at one point with him in the lineup and Ja Morant out of the lineup. Like, it was unreal. During that 56-win season. With Grayson Allen, I mean, that's more of your time with Grayson Allen. But I do remember from afar, them clearing the way for Desmond Bane to kind of get that spot and whatnot. And then, of course, slow-mo, Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton. And when I think of those two guys, I just remember defensively, when we used to talk about with the Grizzlies, havoc-wreaking defense, Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton were two of the biggest pieces to that puzzle from the standpoint I remember talking to DeAnthony Melton, and I'm like, Kyle Anderson thinks he has the best hands on the team. Is his hands better than yours? And Kyle Anderson's like, yeah, my hand's better than his. And Melton's like, nah, no way. But they were those two guys when you think of stocks and things like that, and Jaren as well. But it's gonna be interesting to see all these duos take on the Grizzlies. But Joe, I don't know what's the most interesting one to you, but I think starting off with Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton is fitting. Not only just because they're not Grizzlies anymore and they're both playing with the Warriors, but it'll be both of their first seasons with the Warriors. So Kyle Anderson left the Grizzlies and went to Minnesota. DeAnthony Melton was traded from the Grizzlies to the Philadelphia 76ers. Those two will reunite with Steph Curry and Draymond Green. And we used to have all this talk about the rivalry and stuff like that. It's no secret. Like, Ja Morant doesn't like the Warriors.
Right.
But how does this affect all of that? Like, these are like DeAnthony Melton and Ja Morant are really good friends, but he doesn't like that Bay Area jersey. So like, I'm interested to see how all that part of it plays out, as well as the part about which team is going to be better. But there's some interesting storylines like about the ongoing, I guess, rivalry or dislike or whatever you want to call it between these two teams.
I think for me, the acquisition of Melton and Anderson for Golden State, I agree that there's a rivalry there. And again, Draymond Green will say there is no rivalry, but he's wrong. And I think he does it as a troll to the Memphis fans and the Memphis players. To me, it's more significant personally, my opinion, because I think that you're looking at a team that is likely to get somebody like a Lauri Markkanen, right? And if Golden State pulls that trigger and they go and get that guy, and now you're looking at a 7 foot with a ratchet, or a hatchet, the way that Chandler Parsons used to reference himself incorrectly during his time in Memphis. The way that this guy can space the floor, if that occurs, alongside the defensive prowess and length of a Melton and an Anderson, obviously there's a lot of baggage with Melton for me in particular, because I don't think that trade ever should have happened. I thought that of all the guys that have left, all 6 of these names that we're going to discuss on this episode, to me, Melton is the one that stings the most because for reasons there were opportunities for him to be here, and he wasn't. And I think that was a misstep. Moving on from Anderson, we talked about that yesterday, I believe. Santi Aldama doesn't get minutes if Anderson's still on the team.
Right.
So much about longing for these guys anymore, as much as it is me being concerned, holy crap, like if they do pull off a Markkanen, as they are right now, I'm not necessarily intimidated by the Warriors.
No.
If they are able to pull off a Kuminga salary cap filler like an Andrew Wiggins, I think most people assume, if they're able to do something along those lines and bring in a Markkanen, holy heck, like that's a team that I would be intimidated by, especially defensively. Steph Curry is what he is at this point, but you're dealing with a Melton, Anderson, Draymond Green, and Lauri Markkanen, other 4 at times. That's a heck of a defensive lineup.
Yeah, it is. But they're firmly in that, I guess, conversation for the Lauri Markkanen sweepstakes and whatnot. And it sounds like maybe even the Jazz could be interested in keeping him. But if that were to happen, then yeah, I do think that kind of raises the antennas a little bit. But right now, as the rosters are currently, like, you can tell that the Golden State Warriors are going to be heavily dependent on Steph Curry this upcoming season. And I just don't know if that's a winning formula, at least to be in the top 6 of the Western Conference.
But can Golden State model, and maybe this will be as our conversation goes on here, can Golden State kind of model the way that Memphis won with Kyle Anderson and DeAnthony Melton, creating those extra possessions and getting out a little bit? Again, the guy's name is literally slow-mo, but he was a part of creating transition opportunities.
He was.
Is there some rhyme or reason to that potentially? Do you think that they're taking those stocks into account, and it's for an offense that might struggle a bit at times? The Memphis offense struggled with Anderson and Melton, at least in the half court, but they got out and ran because of the extra possessions they created.
Yeah, and that's a fair point, but it's like there's roster construction things that have to be taken into play too. And the one thing I'm looking at is how are you going to play Kyle Anderson and Draymond Green together for any extended periods or stretches? They both are kind of like those playmaking, 4s in a way, who get after it defensively. Like defensively, it'd probably be nice, but on the offensive end, you're not getting much shooting, if any, from either of those 2 guys. And I just don't, I don't see it being a very successful lineup that you can use unless you have, like you said, a Lauri Markkanen to go out there with a Steph Curry, or Buddy Hield just has the season of his life this year.
Correct.
Or whatever the case may be, you got to factor him in as well. But at the same time, I think the Grizzlies are just much better than no disrespect to Golden State, but they're on the back end. They are definitely on the back end at this point. We have seen the heyday of the Golden State Warriors. Now, the next 2 teams that we'll talk about, Joe, I do think that they are probably bigger threats, in my opinion.
Interesting. Well, let Damichael and I know how you're feeling about the Warriors. Do you agree with him? He's not as concerned about Golden State. As they are currently constructed, I don't disagree. But I think because Steph Curry is on that back end, as you just referenced, they go out and get Markkanen. I think that's a game changer for them. If Markkanen is the second best player on a Golden State team, that can make a major difference. I'll be interested to see how that plays out. Obviously, there's another shoe to drop there, and if it doesn't drop, I'm with you, partner. I think they'll be the ones that kind of continue to fall back in the Western Conference. When we come back on this episode of Locked On Grizzlies, a team that is not likely to fall back is the Phoenix Suns. We talked about Tyus Jones going out to Phoenix on yesterday's show. How does the duo of Grayson and Tyus Jones and Grayson Allen, kind of impact Memphis? What are some stories to keep an eye on there? We'll talk about that next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by the good folks over at Gametime. Trade deadline day is here. I don't know if you've noticed this, Damichael. My Washington Nationals have been moving on from some guys. I think they're not quite ready to contend. We've talked about how your Atlanta Braves are most certainly in their contention window. Even with their injuries, they're still in the mix. Whether it's in Atlanta or in Washington, D.C., going and taking in a ball game is wonderful, not just in those two cities, but anywhere across America and Canada, of course. Shout out to the Toronto Blue Jays. Gametime allows for you to make new memories with those you care about this year. Check out the Gametime app, download it, get last-minute deals, saving up to 60%, buying last minute for not just Major League Baseball games, but most major events. There are flash deals exclusively in the app on select seats ahead of any game or event. You can toggle on the all-in pricing feature to show the total up front with no surprise fees at checkout. And Gametime has amazing ticket coverage, covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying Major League Baseball tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, Tyus Jones, Grayson Allen reunited out in Phoenix. What does that mean for Memphis? Stick around. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. He's the Memphis Grizzlies beat writer for that publication. Follow him on X if you don't already do so at Damichael C. You can follow me on X at Joe Mullinax. And we're talking dynamic duos, and we're using that term loosely, right? Like, no disrespect to these other dynamic duos. I feel like Damichael and I, if we were ranking these four, Damichael Cole and Joe Mullinax are at the top of this dynamic duo ranking. But I digress. We're moving inward. We're moving east from Golden State, taking a look at the Phoenix Suns and the interesting dynamic there. We talked a little bit about it yesterday, partner, how Phoenix is kind of just punting defense, right? The acquisition of Tyus Jones. He's one of the worst defenders in the NBA at his position. Phenomenal assist-to-turnover ratio. I think he's a pretty solid starter in the NBA, but there's trade-offs there. As good as he is in terms of the facilitation aspect, he struggles in the opposite end. You would imagine that probably guarantees Grayson Allen being in that sixth-man role coming off the bench if the starters are Tyus and then Bradley Beal, Devin Booker, Kevin Durant, and I believe Nurkic is still there in Phoenix.
Yep.
So you would assume those are the starting five for Phoenix, and then Grayson will come off the bench. When you look at the Phoenix setup and compare it to what Memphis is doing, are there any storylines that jump out at you? Does this put Phoenix ahead of the Grizzlies? You were pretty confident in saying that didn't happen for Golden State, even though they have a couple of former Memphis players in the fold. What about now that Phoenix has Tyus Jones?
Yeah, I'm going to address this one because now I think Tyus Jones makes Phoenix much better. Like the starting point. We talked about it a little bit yesterday, how Phoenix was one of the worst teams in the NBA, especially down the stretch. Like we saw they had a lot of fourth quarter struggles last year, and it was pretty much because they would turn the ball over and get very isolation heavy and dependent on their stars, and they couldn't just generate efficient offense in those case scenarios. Now you bring a point guard like Tyus Jones, you're able to have cleaner, more efficient, end of the game scoring situations, which should lead to better finishes from the Suns and more wins overall. Now, with all that being said, here's the thing. The Suns, this is a Western Conference thing because the Grizzlies will have their teams as well, and everyone will because the West is just too good. I don't think there's any team that's just going to be leaps and bounds above every team in the Western Conference. I'd be very surprised if that's the case. The Suns are going to have certain teams that just have their number. It's just, we match up terribly against those teams. I think the Grizzlies are at the top of that list. If not number one, they're going to be probably top 2-3 teams the Suns just don't match up well against the most. Number one is Jaren Jackson Jr. I mean, we saw it a couple times last year when he played the Suns. They would guard him with Kevin Durant, too little. They would guard him with Nurkic, too slow. They had no answer for Jaren Jackson Jr., and he was aggressive. And even going back to last season, I think I remember, if I remember correctly, even in the game where Steven Adams, I don't hate to bring that one up, but even in the game that Steven Adams was injured, like Jaren Jackson Jr. was dominating, the Suns in that matchup. So all that to say is they just don't match up well against Jaren. And now when you factor in the Tyus Jones factor, when you say Tyus Jones point guard, Bradley Beal's your 2 probably, Devin Booker's your 3, one of them's got to guard Ja. Who's it going to be? I mean, are you guarding Ja with – you're definitely not guarding him with Tyus Jones. You guarding him with Bradley Beal?
That would be pretty tough.
Bradley Beal's going to put in the effort. He's going to compete. Devin Booker is a much improved defender from what he used to be, but guarding, the second or third options on offenses and guarding Ja Morant, I mean, it ain't the same thing. So I'm looking at that team and I'm thinking, I don't see an answer for guarding Jaren. I don't see an answer for guarding Ja. And we know defensively, the Grizzlies, because Taylor Jenkins, like you can talk bad about the offense all you want. They'll be a top 10 defense. No ifs, ands, buts about it. So when you factor in all those things, a strong defense against a strong Suns offense that'll be able to hold its own. Like the defense will be able to hold its own. No answer for Ja. No answer for Jaren. Look, Tyus Jones is going to make – look, they probably – if they play the Suns, 4 times, the Suns will probably score 130 in one of those games and can't miss and probably blow the doors off the Grizzlies, beat them by 25 or something. But when you look at the bigger picture, like it's going to be – I just don't see it. I mean, Joe, maybe you see something different. But when I look at how the Suns match up against the Grizzlies right now, at least on paper, I don't see the Suns having that many advantages other than, I mean, they have talent, Kevin Durant, Devin Booker, but schematically, it doesn't make much sense to me.
I'll go out on the record here, and I will say that I think this is the most likely Grizzlies first-round playoff opponent next year. I think that if you look at the Western Conference and you have Minnesota, Oklahoma City, maybe even Denver in front of Memphis, I don't know if I would have Denver in front of them at this point, but I'm trying to be unbiased. Say the Grizzlies are the 4 or 5 seed in the Western Conference, Phoenix is probably in that mix too. So this feels like a logical kind of matchup. Or maybe the Lakers jump up in front of Denver or something like that. But I digress. The Clippers obviously still exist too. I'm curious by how they have hired Mike Budenholzer, right? That's an important thing to understand. And the realities of that in terms of Taylor Jenkins's mentor, obviously, in that spot. Defensively, a lot of the schemes that Jenkins employs he got from Bud and other places, of course, as well. But I am curious to see how all that kind of plays out for Memphis and Phoenix. That just seems like, in terms of a rivalry, that seems like one, again, if we're assuming that Golden State's going backwards, barring some major trade, I think Phoenix is in a place where Memphis can look at that team and say, if we want to get where we want to go, we're going to have to go through the Suns.
Yeah, I can see that. But Suns and rivalry, it just look the Suns as currently constructed because of these apron penalties and whatnot. I just don't see them being that team for very long. Like it's going to be hard.
One injury will screw them over completely. Yeah. There's no denying that.
I just you think like how the Grizzlies and the Warriors have matched up over the years and whatnot. Like in 2 or 3 years, the Suns probably Bradley Beal or Devin Booker or someone's like Kevin Durant's going to be 38. Like they got a lot going on over there. But with all that being said, I do agree with your point. Like this is probably a likely first round matchup. And I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if the Suns take a regular season leap, because in the regular season you can be an amazing offense and blow the doors off people. It's just, you're still very vulnerable in the playoffs when, the game slows down. I mean, we've seen it with the Grizzlies, how they score very easily a lot of times in the regular season because of their ability to get out and run and just have this free-flowing offense. But when you get to the playoffs and the game gets a little muddy, like are you going to be able to play in the dirt a little bit? And the pretty hot, in those case scenarios. So I could see the Suns, and for lack of better words, being a pretty team, being the team like the old Suns team, like the Steve Nash years, right? Being that high-flying offense that gets you a top 2, top 3 seed. So I could see them actually being a high seed. But, I don't know what that will mean, for the playoffs. And I still think if the Grizzlies and the Suns were to match up in the playoff series, I think that, Jaren, he goes like – I think it was you that said Giannis Light at one point, right?
Yeah,
I'm not
absolutely.
Right? He looks real true. Giannis Light when he plays against them.
That's fair, and I do think that it's important to understand that you've got a really, really talented Memphis team coming back, right? And I don't want it to seem like I'm degrading that. I just think the Western Conference is going to be really tough.
It is.
And one of the reasons the Western Conference is going to be really tough is the teams that are trying to contend. Both of the teams we've talked about, Golden State and Phoenix, are in that boat. The final team that we're going to talk about is in the Memphis Grizzlies division. So we'll have to see them 4 times, and they're certainly going to try to contend with 2 of the pillars of previous great Grizzlies defenses. We're going to be talking about Steven Adams and Dillon Brooks next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by my wonderful co-host and partner, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. Make sure that you're following him on X if you don't already, at Damichael C. Follow me on X, at Joe Mullinax. We talked Golden State. We've talked Phoenix. We're going to close out this episode, partner, taking a look at the Houston Rockets, who, by the way, if memory serves correctly, they are probably betting on the demise of the Phoenix Suns down the road. Aren't they the ones that own a lot of the draft rights to some of what Phoenix is doing?
They got a draft switch. One of the for I think it's next year or the year after that. So they're mixed in there for sure. Yeah,
they're thinking that and they're among others that the downfall of Phoenix is coming sooner.
The Grizzlies are in there too. Like everybody wants some of those Suns picks. Like it's hot commodity.
Because if it doesn't work, it's really not going to work. But I think the Houston Rockets, if we're assuming Phoenix is stationary, if we're assuming that Golden State's falling back, a lot of folks have the Rockets as a team moving up because they're a good mix of young talent and veteran presence. 2 of the guys that provide that veteran presence are familiar to Grizzlies fans, Dillon Brooks, of course, and Steven Adams, 2 players that have been, sign and trade, I believe it was with Dillon, and then, of course, the Steve-O trade down the road. Beyond that, looking at what those 2 guys bring to the table, the fact it's a division rivalry, how do you see a healthy Steven Adams and a Dillon Brooks helping Houston get to where they're trying to go, which is, to be honest with you, in front of the Memphis Grizzlies?
Yeah, I got a different one for you on this one, Joe.
Okay.
When you watch the Grizzlies play a lot of times over the last couple years, it's very rare, right, that we look and say that team was tougher than Memphis. Teams might be more talented, might be better, but we rarely say, "Oh, that team out physical, out tough the Grizzlies." Like
unless it's the playoffs.
Unless it's the playoffs, it happens in the playoffs, and those teams had some real tough dudes. But in this case, you think of Steven Adams, think of Dillon Brooks, even to like Ime Udoka, Fred VanVleet. The list goes on. Like when you think Houston Rockets basketball going forward, toughness is going to be a big part of it. Are the Grizzlies going to be tougher than them? That's where I'm at, because I do think, again, when you go back to the Grizzlies roster, I keep going referencing the 56-win team. A lot of those pieces are gone now. Xavier Tillman, really tough dude. Dillon Brooks, Steven Adams, Kyle Anderson was a big part of the toughness there. But you got Marcus Smart now. But you got Vince Williams. You guys, we just saw in just 6 quarters, he ain't afraid to mix it up in there when the guy knocked Jake LaRavia down and whatnot. So you got Desmond Bane, you got Jaren. Like toughness and physicality is going to be a big part of those matchups against the Rockets. I think the Grizzlies are the more talented team on paper. Being the Rockets have a lot of what I call B-level talent. There's no disrespect to any of those guys, but there's the reason they're star hunting right now, because there's no one guy who's like, oh yeah, that's the guy. Every game, ball in his hands, we live or die with it. The Rockets don't have that guy. They got a bunch of guys. When Jalen Green is playing like he did in what was that, March of last season or February, whenever it was, when he just went in fuego, that's your guy then. When Alperen Sengun is playing the way he did at the start of last season, oh, that's your guy then. when Jabari Smith is showing those signs where, oh, yeah, that's why he was a top 3 pick. That's your guy then. And then, of course, you got the vets, Fred VanVleet, when he's having a real good night, or whatever the case may be. But it's too many different guys. It's not that one option. So I want to see how their identity falls into play. Whereas the Grizzlies, even though so many guys missed a lot of time last season, Joe, we don't have any questions about who's the big dogs in Memphis. Like we know who's going to get the ball when it's time for that phone to ring with 8 seconds left in the game. We know what number they're going to call.
It's usually going to be 12, right? Even and the teammates, even Jaren and Dez are like, "What are you talking about?" Right? You're taking the shot. I do think that's an important point. What makes me most interested in the Houston Rockets matchup, Damichael, is I think of the 3 that we've talked about on this episode, very easily the Rockets one is going to be the most testy, right? It's going to be the most physical. You want to talk about a rivalry. Dylan Brooks feels slighted. I think we talked about it before we started recording this episode. Dylan says he's never going to lose to Memphis. Like that, he's said on record, I'm not going to lose to the Grizzlies. He probably will, but the point is he's willing to take that stance. Steven Adams and all the uncertainty, should he have the surgery, should he not have the surgery? There's nothing necessarily public about animosity there, but there's kind of like an undercurrent. I want to stress, I don't have any sources. I'm not outing anything. This is me just kind of taking in how the Adams era ended in Memphis. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, at least to my eye. So I think this is when we see Houston for the first time, this is the game that has the biggest possibility for being a little bit more physical perhaps than the others because of those relationships and how they were strained at the end of their times in Memphis.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point because when you think about Tyus' exit, Tyus, he pretty much wanted to. He wanted a bigger opportunity. Like, that was self-explanatory. DeAnthony Melton was traded. Kyle Anderson, the writing was on the wall there. We knew the Grizzlies and, had a long tenure in Memphis. He's a pro. He's a pro's pro. With Dylan, he wanted to be here, but he wanted a different role and all those things. He was very public towards the end of his tenure. And you saw kind of the Grizzlies in a way kind of shift slowly but surely from his style. Like Dylan Brooks we talk about it on here a lot, how he kind of gave the Grizzlies this different level of swagger and things like that. But as you start to see, basically pretty much what happened last season is it was less of the trash talk and stuff like that, even though they didn't have much to trash talk for. But even before the season started, it was very clear that they were shifting from that, young team that's just going to, say wild stuff all the time. And, with Steven Adams, like to a much lesser degree, he's been pretty quiet about what happened towards the end of his tenure. But I think anybody with 2 eyes and 2 ears would say that it wasn't normal. What happened with
he literally was playing preseason basketball until he wasn't.
He was playing preseason basketball. He started preseason game and looked like Steven Adams. Like it was a very strange sequence that was going on. But all that being said, and the fact that Dylan Brooks is going to be a very big piece of this team, Steven Adams is probably going to come off the bench probably first time in his career. I don't know if he probably came off the bench as a rookie. I don't really remember, but Steven Adams has pretty much been a starter for most, if not all, of his NBA career. So it's going to be a different role for him in Houston. And, it'll be interesting to see, how Zach Edey, takes in that matchup and how Jaren, battles against Steve-O and whatnot. But I think physicality is going to be the name of the game in that matchup. Dylan Brooks, when he sees – because Dylan Brooks didn't get Ja this past season. He saw Dez a lot, and you saw him and Dez – would get after it a little bit. Fun banner. But we haven't seen Ja and Dylan go at it yet. I think that's going to be a lot of fun too.
Steven Adams probably isn't used to being the smallest guy, or not the biggest guy on the court, I should say. But when he shares the floor with Zach Edey at 7'4", 300 pounds, Edey is going to be bigger than Steven Adams. That's going to be a really interesting pairing, to say the least. Let us know in the comments, how are you feeling about Golden State, Phoenix, Houston? Do you agree with our kind of storyline perspectives? Do you see anybody being a particular threat? Let us know in the comments. Hit us up there, or hit us up on X again, at Damichael C for Damichael, at Joe Mullinax for me over on X, formerly known, of course, as Twitter. That's it for this episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Thank you guys for being with us wherever you're checking out the show. We'll close out July. obviously tomorrow on the podcast. And maybe we check in on the Olympics. Maybe we see how things are going overseas. Obviously, this is kind of the slowing down point of the offseason. Maybe any loose ends that need to be tidied up. Obviously, Luke Kennard, as of this recording, still not in the mix for Memphis. Where all the Grizzlies can maybe work around the margins, like the Jay Huff signing, to try to get better. Maybe that can be a focus of our Wednesday episode.
Yeah, by the time most people will see this episode, Santi will have already played his second FIBA game, and he'll be playing against Giannis Antetokounmpo.
There you go.
We talk about strength, right? We talk about him being more physical. It's very clear. And some people have told me that Santi has gotten bigger. I don't know how much bigger at this point, but he is bigger. So you know what? It's a good test of how much bigger and how much stronger he is. Go against Giannis Antetokounmpo. I'm really interested to see that.
Yeah, I think that'll be a wonderful opportunity for Santi to show he can indeed be a pretty big contributor to Memphis one way or another this coming season. Check out our next episode for conversations about that and more. Thank you so much for being here for today's episode of Locked On Grizzlies. Like, comment, rate, review, most importantly, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, YouTube. Check out Locked On Sports Today as well, the first of its kind 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. You can also check it out over on Amazon Fire and the free TV channels app. All the great content that Locked On Podcast Network provides in one place. Damichael and I pop up over there every once in a while, but it's a great resource for anybody that's tired of the screaming on ESPN or Fox Sports. Check out Locked On Sports Today. And make sure you're checking out Locked On Grizzlies each and every time an episode drops. Thank you to everyone who's an everydayer. Each and every time we have a new show, you're with us, taking in the content, hitting us up in the comments, tweeting at us or posting at us, whatever it's called now. Damichael and I really appreciate it. And as we enter the dog days of the offseason for the NBA, we're going to appreciate maybe some questions that you want Damichael and I to answer, or we can post that on social media as well, partner. Let us know in the comments topics you want us to cover as we get into August and things get a little more slim in terms of content. We're happy for any ideas that you might have for us. For Damichael, I am Joe. We will talk more on our Wednesday episode. Until then, stay locked in. Like, comment, rate, review, subscribe, Apple, Amazon, Spotify, YouTube. We appreciate wherever you take in the podcast. Catch you next time on Locked On Grizzlies.